When I was 10, I went trick-or-treating with two of my friends, Ben and Jeremy. It was a chilly Halloween night in our small town of Willow Creek, where the autumn leaves painted the streets in shades of orange and brown, and the air was thick with the excitement of the night's festivities. We were dressed in our costumes. I was a pirate, Ben was a zombie, and Jeremy, ever the creative one, had fashioned himself into a miniature Frankenstein's monster. The plan was simple: hit every house on Maple Street, known for its lavish decorations and generous candy handouts, then circle back through the old part of town, which most kids avoided due to its eerie, almost abandoned feel. Our bags were getting heavy with sweets when we decided to take the shortcut through the old district to get to the final, most anticipated house, the Henderson Mansion. Legend had it that Mr. Henderson, who passed away years ago, loved Halloween so much that his spirit still gave out the best candy in town. As we walked down the dimly lit path, the jovial chatter among us dimmed to a nervous whisper. The houses here were different. They seemed out of time, with overgrown gardens and windows like dark, unseeing eyes. The streetlights flickered, casting long, dancing shadows that played tricks on our eyes. We approached the Henderson Mansion, its gates creaking ominously in the wind. Unlike other years, there were no lights, no pumpkins, just an unsettling silence. But Ben, always the bravest, or perhaps the most foolhardy, pushed open the gate. "Let's just check if there's anyone," he said with a mix of excitement and fear. The path to the door felt longer than it should. With each step, the air grew colder and the night darker. Jeremy rang the bell, which echoed like a dirge. There was no answer, just the whisper of the wind through the trees, sounding almost like laughter. Just as we turned to leave, disappointed, the door creaked open by itself. Inside, darkness beckoned. A bowl of candy sat on a small table right by the entrance, with a note in old-fashioned handwriting, "Take one if you dare." Ben reached in first, but as he did, something cold brushed against his hand. He yelped and pulled back, but his candy was in his grasp. Jeremy went next, his hand trembling. I was last, my heart pounding. As I grabbed a piece, the door slammed shut with a force that shook the frame, and a chilling voice whispered, "Thank you for visiting." We ran, the sound of our own heartbeats thundering in our ears, not stopping until we were back under the safety of streetlights on familiar ground. Panting, we looked at our loot. Instead of candy, we found small, old-fashioned trinkets. Ben had a tiny rusted key, Jeremy a piece of broken mirror, and I held a small silver locket with an engraving that read E.H., Ezra Henderson. That night, we didn't speak much, each of us haunted by the feeling that we had not just trick-or-treated at a house, but had somehow participated in a ghostly transaction. Years later, the trinkets are still with us, reminders of that Halloween when we got more than just candy. We got a story that chilled us to the bone. It was a story of a night when the boundary between the living and the dead seemed to blur, right there in Willow Creek. I remember this one time as a kid I went trick-or-treating and there was a very thick fog. It was like the most fog I'd seen in my life ever. I think I was around 7 and my younger sister was 4 and we were both trick-or-treating with our parents. The fog was so dense that it turned the familiar streets into a maze of ghostly shapes and shadows. The streetlights glowed like distant orbs, barely piercing the mist. That night, we were dressed as a little witch and a tiny vampire, our costumes slightly damp from the fog. Our parents, trying to keep the Halloween spirit alive despite the eerie weather, led us from house to house. But with every step, the world seemed to grow quieter, the usual cacophony of excited children and music fading into a muffled silence. We approached what we thought was the next house on our route, but in the fog it was hard to tell. The house looked different, older, with an antique iron gate slightly ajar, inviting us in with an eerie creak. There were no pumpkins, no lights, just a dim glow from within. My parents, perhaps thinking it was just an unenthusiastic participant in the night's festivities, encouraged us to go up to the door. As we walked up the path, the fog seemed to thicken even more, and I felt a chill that wasn't just from the cold. The door was old, with peeling paint, and when I knocked, it slowly swung inward with a groan. There was no one there to greet us, but the entryway was lit by candles, flickering shadows on the walls. "Trick or treat," my sister called out, her voice small in the vast, silent air. From deep within the house, we heard a soft, slow shuffle. An elderly woman appeared, her eyes milky white, almost as if she was part of the fog itself. She smiled, but there was something off about it, something that didn't reach her eyes. "Ah, children," she whispered, her voice like dry leaves. Come in, I have treats for you." My parents, who I thought were right behind us, seemed nowhere in sight. probably obscured by the fog, or perhaps they had stepped back to give us the thrill of independence. The woman handed us each an old-fashioned candy, wrapped in wax paper. As I took mine, her hand brushed against mine, cold as death itself. "Be careful tonight, little ones," she said. "Not all who walk in the fog are as kind as I." We thanked her and turned to leave, eager to get back to our parents, but as we stepped out, the house seemed to vanish into the mist. We ran, candies clutched in our hands, back to where we last saw our parents, but they were gone. Panic set in as we called out, our voices swallowed by the fog. Then, from the mist, figures started to emerge, not our parents, but children, many children, all with pale faces and old-fashioned clothes. They moved silently, their eyes hollow. One of them, a boy who might have been my age, whispered, "You shouldn't have taken the candy." Just as terror was about to overwhelm us, our parents' voices pierced the fog, calling our names. The figures dissolved into the mist as if they were never there. We ran towards the voices, finding our parents looking worried but unaware of our fright. We never spoke of that house again, and the candies, we threw them away, never unwrapping them. But every Halloween after, in the corner of my eye, I'd see the fog thicken unnaturally, and sometimes, in the deepest part of the night, I'd hear that dry leaf whisper, "Be careful, little ones." I grew up in the suburbs, and not necessarily in the best part of town. Our own neighborhood was pretty safe, but my parents were always strict about how far away from our house I could go with my friends. That carried over on Halloween. Every year, they draw an invisible line on the map of our neighborhood that I was not to cross. But as I got older, the allure of unexplored streets, rumored to have the best candy, became too tempting to resist. The Halloween night of 2017, I was 13, and with a mix of bravado and curiosity, my friends and I decided to venture beyond the known boundaries. We figured, what could go wrong in just one night of harmless trick-or-treating? The streets we chose were quieter than ours, with houses that seemed older, their decorations more elaborate but somehow off. Not the cheerful pumpkins and playful ghosts, but more like scenes from gothic horror tales. The first few houses were generous with their treats, but there was an eerie silence, punctuated only by the distant, muffled sounds of other children in more distant neighborhoods. At the end of the street stood a house that looked straight out of a Victorian horror story, with overgrown ivy, dim lights, and an iron gate slightly ajar, as if inviting us in. We hesitated, but the challenge in each other's eyes pushed us forward. The path was lined with what we thought were incredibly realistic decorations of lost souls, their expressions too lifelike. We knocked, and the door creaked open on its own. Inside, the hallway was lit by candles, casting long, dancing shadows. An old woman, dressed in what can only be described as a blend between a witch and a Victorian widow, greeted us with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Trick or treat," we chimed, less confidently than we started. "Ah, travelers from beyond the line," she said in a voice like dry leaves. "Come in, I have special treats for the brave." We stepped inside, the air growing colder as we did. She led us to a table where peculiar, handmade candies lay. They looked delicious, but had an odd, almost metallic sheen. "Go on," she urged. "These are treats that will let you see beyond the veil." Skeptical, but not wanting to seem rude or scared, we each took one. As soon as the candy touched my tongue, the room spun. The decor shifted before our eyes. The paintings on the walls now moved, depicting scenes of our own fears. My friend Timmy saw spiders, his greatest phobia, crawling out from the frames, while I saw shadows whispering my name, reaching out with cold, intangible fingers. Panicking, we tried to leave, but the door wouldn't budge. The woman's voice echoed around us, now menacing. "You wanted to see beyond your safe little world, didn't you? Now, see it all." The room morphed into a nightmare. Each corner held our personal dreads, but the terror peaked when we realized the house itself was alive, feeding off our fear. The walls pulsed like a heartbeat. After what felt like hours, the door suddenly swung open and we ran out, the candy's effects fading as we distanced ourselves from the house. We didn't stop until we crossed back into our familiar territory, panting and horrified. The next day, we ventured back in daylight to see the house, but where it stood was now just an empty lot with overgrown weeds, as if the house had never existed. We never spoke of it again, each of us carrying the weight of that night in silence. From then on, I respected my parents' boundaries, not because they set them, but because I learned there are lines in this world, and perhaps others, that are not meant to be crossed. When I was in 5th grade, we did trick-or-treating at my school. It was an annual tradition where the hallways were transformed with cobwebs, eerie lights, and the classrooms became mini haunted houses. That year, however, something felt different. The air was colder, the decorations seemed too real, and there was an unsettling silence that clung to the walls. Our teacher, Mr. Craven, was known for his love of Halloween. He would go all out with costumes and stories that would keep you up at night. That evening, he dressed as a Victorian undertaker, complete with a top hat that shadowed his eyes in an eerie manner. He welcomed us with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, saying, "Tonight, children, the spirits are particularly restless." We started our trick-or-treating at the usual classrooms. Each teacher had prepared something spooky, but as we moved deeper into the school, things began to change. The lights flickered more frequently, and the usual playful screams turned into whispers of confusion and fear. My friends and I reached the last classroom, which was always handled by Mr. Craven himself. The door was slightly ajar, with the dim light spilling out. Pushing it open, we expected the usual jump scares, but instead we found an empty room with just a single, old-fashioned mirror at the end. It was ornately framed. Something about it beckoned us closer. As we approached, our reflections started to distort. Instead of our costumes, we saw figures in the mirror that looked decayed, ghostly, with hollow eyes staring back at ours. My friend Anthony reached out to touch the mirror, and his reflection grinned back at him, its hand coming out of the mirror as if to pull him in. We screamed and stepped back, but the room felt like it was shrinking. The door we came through was now gone, replaced by a solid wall. The only way out seemed to be through the mirror. Mr. Craven's voice echoed around us, but he was nowhere to be seen. "To leave, you must take the place of one who seeks freedom," his voice whispered, chilling us to the bone. We realized with horror that the figures in the mirror were past students, trapped in some sort of Halloween curse. They were pleading silently, their expressions desperate. My friend Sarah, ever the brave one, said, "We have to choose or we'll be stuck here." In a moment of sheer panic and bravery, we each picked a figure in the mirror, hoping this was the right choice. As we touched the glass, it felt like ice, and a cold hand grasped each of ours. There was a blinding light, and then darkness. We woke up outside the school, lying on the grass, the night sky above us. The school looked normal, the lights were on, and we could hear laughter from inside. Shaken, we checked ourselves, half expecting to see some change, but we were just as we had been, costumes and all. However, from that night on, every Halloween, I feel an inexplicable chill, like someone's watching me. And sometimes, in the reflection of any mirror, I catch a glimpse of those hollow eyes, reminding me of the night we trick-or-treated at school. It reminds me that something from the other side came, a little too close for comfort.